The Flying Dutchman is a legendary ghost ship that can never make port and is doomed to sail the oceans forever. The myth is likely to have originated from 17th century nautical folklore. The oldest extant version dates to the late 18th century. Sightings in the 19th and 20th centuries reported the ship to be glowing with ghostly light. If hailed by another ship, the crew of the Flying Dutchman will try to send messages to land, or to people long dead. In ocean lore, the sight of this phantom ship is a portent of doom. Origins: the first reference in print to the ship appears in Chapter 6 of A Voyage to Botany Bay, attributed to George Barrington. I had often heard of the superstition of sailors respecting apparitions, but had never given much credit to the report. It seems that some years since a Dutch man-of-war was lost off the Cape of Good Hope, and every soul on board perished. Her consort weathered the gale, and arrived soon after at the Cape. Having refitted, and returning to Europe, they were assailed by a violent tempest nearly in the same latitude. In the night watch some of the people saw, or imagined they saw, a vessel standing for them under a press of sail, as though she would run them down. One in particular affirmed it was the ship that had foundered in the former gale, and that it must certainly be her, or the apparition of her. But on its clearing up, the object, a dark thick cloud, disappeared. Nothing could do away the idea of this phenomenon on the minds of the sailors. And, on their relating the circumstances when they arrived in port, the story spread like wildfire, and the supposed phantom was called the Flying Dutchman. From the Dutch the English seamen got the infatuation, and there are very few Indiamen, but what is someone on board, who pretends to have seen the apparition? The next literary reference, which introduces the motif of punishment for a crime, was in John Lydon, Scenes of Infancy. It is a common superstition of mariners, that, in the high southern latitudes on the coast of Africa, hurricanes are frequently ushered in by the appearance of a spectre ship, denominated the Flying Dutchman. The crew of this vessel are supposed to have been guilty of some dreadful crime, in the infancy of navigation, and to have been stricken with pestilence, and are ordained still to traverse the ocean on which they perished, till the period of their penance expire. Thomas Moore in his poem written on passing Dead Man's Island in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, late in the evening, September, 1804 places the vessel in the North Atlantic, fast gliding along, a gloomy bark / her sails are full, though the wind is still, / and there blows not a breath her sails to fill. A footnote adds, the above lines were suggested by a superstition very common among sailors, who call this ghost ship, I think, the Flying Dutchman. Sir Walter Scott, a friend of John Lydon's, was the first to refer to the vessel as a pirate ship, writing in the notes to Rokeby, a poem that the ship was originally a vessel loaded with great wealth, on board of which some horrid act of murder and piracy had been committed, and that the apparition of the ship is considered by the mariners as the worst of all possible omens. According to some sources, the 17th-century Dutch captain Bernard Fock is the model for the captain of the ghost ship. Fock was renowned for the speed of his trips from the Netherlands to Java and was suspected of being in league with the devil. The first version of the legend as a story was printed, in Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine for May 1821, which puts the scene as the Cape of Good Hope. This story introduces the name Captain Hendrik van der Decken for the captain and the motifs of letters addressed to people long dead being offered to other ships for delivery, but if accepted will bring misfortune. And the captain having sworn to round the Cape of Good Hope though it should take until the Day of Judgment. She was an Amsterdam vessel and sailed from port 70 years ago. Her master's name was Van der Decken. He was a staunch seaman, and would have his own way in spite of the devil. For all that, never a sailor under him had reason to complain. Though how it is on board with them nobody knows. The story is this, that in doubling the Cape they were a long day trying to weather the Table Bay. However, the wind headed them, and went against them more and more, and Van der Decken walked the deck, swearing at the wind. Just after sunset a vessel spoke him, asking him if he did not mean to go into the bay that night. Van der Decken replied, "May I be eternally damned if I do, though I should beat about here till the Day of Judgment." And to be sure, he never did go into that bay, for it is believed that he continues to beat about in these seas still, and will do so long enough. This vessel is never seen but with foul weather along with her. There have been many reported sightings in the 19th and 20th centuries. One was by Prince George of Wales, the future King George V. During his late adolescence, in 1880, with his elder brother Prince Albert Victor of Wales, he was on a 3-year voyage with their tutor Dalton, temporarily shipped into HMS Inconstant after the damaged rudder in their original ship, the 4,000-ton corvette Bake Shanty, was repaired. Off the coast of Australia, between Melbourne and Sydney, Dalton records. At 4 a.m. the Flying Dutchman crossed our bows. A strange red light as of a phantom ship all aglow, in the midst of which light the masts, spars and sails of a brig 200 yards distant stood out in strong relief as she came up on the port bow, where also the officer of the watch from the bridge clearly saw her, as did the quarter-deck midshipman, who was sent forward at once to the forecastle. But on arriving there was no vestige nor any sign whatever of any material ship was to be seen either near or right away to the horizon, the night being clear and the sea calm. 13 persons altogether saw her. At 10:45 a.m. the ordinary seaman who had this morning reported the Flying Dutchman fell from the fore topmast cross trees onto the topgallant forecastle and was smashed to atoms. Explanations is an optical illusion. Probably the most credible explanation is a superior mirage or fata morgana seen at sea. The news soon spread through the vessel that a phantom ship with a ghostly crew was sailing in the air over a phantom ocean, and that it was a bad omen, and meant that not one of them should ever see land again. The captain was told the wonderful tale, and coming on deck, he explained to the sailors that this strange appearance was caused by the reflection of some ship that was sailing on the water below this image, but at such a distance they could not see it. There were certain conditions of the atmosphere, he said, when the sun's rays could form a perfect picture in the air of objects on the earth, like the images one sees in glass or water, but they were not generally upright, as in the case of this ship, but reverseed turned bottom upwards. This appearance in the air is called a mirage. He told a sailor to go up to the foretop and look beyond the phantom ship. The man obeyed, and reported that he could see on the water, below the ship in the air, one precisely like it. Just then another ship was seen in the air, only this one was a steamship, and was bottom upwards, as the captain had said these mirages generally appeared. Soon after, the steamship itself came in sight. The sailors were now convinced, and never afterwards believed in phantom ships. Another optical effect, known as looming, occurs when rays of light are bent across different refractive indices. This could make a ship just off the horizon appear hoisted in the air. Adaptations: there is a 20-foot one design high-performance two-person monohull racing dinghy named the Flying Dutchman. It made its Olympic debut at the 1960 Olympics Games and is still one of the fastest racing dinghies in the world. In artworks and design, the Flying Dutchman has been captured in paintings by Albert Ryder, now in the Smithsonian American Art Museum, Washington, D.C., and by Howard Pyle, an artist famous for illustrations of pirates. Dutch artist Joyce O'Fuel also adapted the name of the Flying Dutchman onto her crochet pattern designs, resembling the similarity of her designs roaming the world just like the ghost ship once did. Flying Dutchman tobacco was a popular blend for pipes and smoking. Many of their tins are still readily collected by those who appreciate packaging art and design. In television series and manga, the Flying Dutchman is a recurring character on the popular Nickelodeon cartoon series SpongeBob SquarePants, although he is drawn resembling a famous pirate, Edward Teach, best known as Blackbeard. He is often in episodes that deal with repentance of wrongdoings and moral judgment. In Eiichiro Oda's manga One Piece, Vanderdecken is the Flying Dutchman's captain. In Soul Eater, the Flying Dutchman is the soul of the ghost ship. In the 1967 Spider-Man cartoon episode Return of the Flying Dutchman, the legend of the Flying Dutchman was used by Spider-Man's enemy Mysterio to frighten villagers and plunder their wealth. In a 1976 episode of Land of the Lost, the Marshals discover the captain of a mysterious ship that appears in the mist. Later in the episode it is discovered that the ship is the Flying Dutchman. In The Simpsons animated series, Captain Horatio McAllister, or just simply the Sea Captain, is a sea captain and owner of the Flying Dutchman restaurant. An episode of Night Gallery, hosted by Rod Serling, features a shipwrecked survivor who claims he is a Flying Dutchman. He appears to the crews of several famously doomed ships before they sank, such as the Titanic and the Lusitania. An episode called The Arrival of the TV series The Twilight Zone depicts an airplane that arrives at a busy airport. The airplane is discovered to have no crew, passengers, or luggage. At the tail end of the prior episode, Rod Serling advertises The Arrival as a retelling of the Flying Dutchman tale. In an episode of Supernatural, a ghost ship heralds the death of the victims of a first mate's ghost. The ship is compared to the Flying Dutchman by one of the characters. The pilot of White Collar sees the protagonist figure out the FBI cannot track a suspect as they have given him the nickname the Dutchman, and a link to the ship is made. In film, the story was dramatized in the 1951 film Pandora and the Flying Dutchman, starring James Mason and Ava Gardner. In this version, the Flying Dutchman is a man, not a ship. The 2-hour-long film, scripted by its director Albert Lewin, sets the main action on the Mediterranean coast of Spain during the summer of 1930. Centuries earlier, the Dutchman had killed his wife, wrongly believing her to be unfaithful. Providence condemned him to roam the seas until he found the true meaning of love. In the only plot device taken from earlier versions of the story, once every 7 years the Dutchman is allowed ashore for 6 months to search for a woman who will love him enough to die for him, releasing him from his curse, and he finds her in Pandora. In Disney's Pirates of the Caribbean films, the ship made its first appearance in Dead Man's Chest under the command of the fictional captain, Davy Jones. The story and attributes of the ship were inspired by the actual Flying Dutchman of nautical lore. In literature, the 1797 98 poem by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, contains a similar account of a ghost ship, which may have been influenced by the tale of the Flying Dutchman. This story was adapted in the English melodrama The Flying Dutchman, or The Phantom Ship, a nautical drama, in 3 acts by Edward Fitzball, music by George Rodwell, and the novel The Phantom Ship by Frederick Marryat. This in turn was later adapted as Het Vliegensschip by the Dutch clergyman, A.H.C. Ra Paragraaf Mayer. In Marryat's version, Terneuzen, in the Netherlands, is described as the home of the captain, who is called Van der Decken. The Edgar Allan Poe short story Misfound in a Bottle recounts a story of a shipwreck survivor who finds himself on an ancient ship with an aged and listless crew. The descriptions of the ship mirror the Flying Dutchman legend. Another adaptation was The Flying Dutchman on Tappan Zee by Washington Irving, in which the captain is named Ramhout van Dam. Irving had already used the story in his Bracebridge Hall. Hedvig Ekdahl describes visions of the Flying Dutchman from the books she reads in the attic in Henrik Ibsen's The Wild Duck. John Boyle O'Reilly's The Flying Dutchman was first published in The Wild Goose, a handwritten newspaper produced by Fenian convicts being transported to Western Australia in 1867. Later versions with minor variations were also published. British author Brian Jacques wrote a trilogy of fantasy young adult novels concerning 2 reluctant members of the Dutchman's crew, a young boy and his dog, who were swept off the ship by a wave on the night the ship was cursed. However, the same angel who pronounced the curse on the ship and crew appeared to them and blessed them, charging them to help those in need. The first novel was titled Castaways of the Flying Dutchman and was first published by Puffin Books in 2001. The second was titled The Angel's Command and was released by Puffin in 2003. The third and final book of the trilogy was titled Voyage of Slaves and was released by Puffin in 2006. In the novel The Flying Dutchman by the Russian novelist Anatoly Kudyavitsky, the ghost ship rebuilds itself from an old barge abandoned on the bank of a big Russian river, and offers itself as a refuge to a persecuted musicologist. The comic fantasy Flying Dutch by Tom Holt is a version of the Flying Dutchman story. In this version, the Dutchman is not a ghost ship but crewed by immortals who can only visit land once every 7 years when the unbearable smell that is a side effect of the elixir of life wears off. The Roger Zelazny short story, And Only I Am Escaped to Tell Thee tells of a sailor who escapes from the Flying Dutchman and is rescued by sailors who welcome him to the Mary Celeste. Ward Moore in his 1951 story Flying Dutchman used the myth as a metaphor for an automated bomber plane which continues to fly over an Earth where humanity long since totally destroyed itself and all life in a nuclear war. In opera and theatre, Richard Wagner's opera, The Flying Dutchman is adapted from an episode in Heinrich Heine's satirical novel The Memoirs of Mr. von Schnabelowski, in which a character attends a theatrical performance of The Flying Dutchman in Amsterdam. Heine had first briefly used the legend in his Reisbilder, Die Nordsee, which simply repeats from Blackwood's magazine the features of the vessel being seen in a storm and sending letters addressed to persons long since dead. In his 1833 elaboration, it was once thought that it may have been based on Fitzball's play, which was playing at the Adelphi Theatre in London, but the run had ended on April 7, 1827 and Heine did not arrive in London until the 14th. Heine was the first author to introduce the chance of salvation through a woman's devotion and the opportunity to set foot on land every 7 years to seek a faithful wife. This imaginary play, unlike Fitzball's play, which is the Cape of Good Hope location, in Heine's account is transferred to the North Sea off Scotland. Wagner's opera was similarly planned to take place off the coast of Scotland, although during the final rehearsals he transferred the action to another part of the North Sea, off Norway. The opera's overture would later become the signature theme for Captain Video and his Video Rangers, one of television's earliest children's potboiler series. Pierre-Louis Deitch composed an opera Le Vaisseau Fantôme, ou La Maudite des Mers, which was first performed on November 9, 1842 at the Paris Opera. The libretto by Paul Foucher and H. Ra copyright foil was based on Walter Scott's The Pirate as well as Captain Marryat's The Phantom Ship and other sources. Olaf Wagner thought it was based on the scenario of his own opera, which he had just sold to the opera. The similarity of Deitch's opera to Wagner's is slight, although Wagner's assertion is often repeated. Berlioz thought Le Vaisseau Fantôme too solemn, but other reviewers were more favorable. In music, in 1949 RCA Victor, inventors of the single 45 RPMs format, released as one of their first 45s a recording of the legend and song in band leader Hugo Winterhalter's The Flying Dutchman, sung as a sea shanty. Jethro Tull referred to The Flying Dutchman on their 1979 album Stormwatch. Tori Amos refers to The Flying Dutchman in her 1992 single B-side Flying Dutchman, the A-side being China. It was re-released in 2012 on her album Gold Dust and performed on the Gold Dust Orchestral Tour. Jimmy Buffett refers to The Flying Dutchman in his 1995 song Remittance Man on the album Barometer Soup. Rufus Wainwright refers to The Flying Dutchman in his song Flying Dutchman in the album Poses. Karek Angren wrote a concept album about The Flying Dutchman entitled Death Came Through a Phantom Ship. God Dethroned, a Dutch death metal band, featured the song Soul Capture 1562 about The Flying Dutchman in their album Bloody Blasphemy. In the 1969 classic self-titled album by the band, The Flying Dutchman was referenced in the song Rockin' Chair. Iron Maiden, a heavy metal band, produced a song titled Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which is loosely based on the poem of the same name, and is in reference to the Flying Dutchman tale. In video games, the Flying Dutchman is a cheat unit in the original Age of Empires computer game. It is a ship that can travel on both land and sea. In the 1993 multi-platform game Alone in the Dark 2, fictional detective Edward Cornby investigates a missing girl who he discovers has been kidnapped by the undead One-Eyed Jack who, in the game, is captain of the undead crew of the Flying Dutchman. In amusement park, the Efteling amusement park in the Netherlands has a roller coaster called the Flying Dutchman which features a character named Willem van der Decken. In aviation, KLM Royal Dutch Airlines references the endless travelling aspect of the famous story by having Flying Dutchman painted on its numerous aircraft below the cockpit and to the right of the nose. See also, List of ghosts, references, notes. Citations. Bibliography. External links, Blackwood's Edinburgh Magazine, May 1821, on the history and sightings of the Flying Dutchman, mainly about Wagner's possible sources, melodramatic possessions, The Flying Dutchman, South Africa and the Imperial Stage circa 1830, The Phantom Ship by Marryat at Project Gutenberg, USA premiere of 1841 critical edition of Wagner's The Flying Dutchman at Boston Lyric Opera, April and May 2013, The Legend of the Flying Dutchman, The Flying Dutchman, Harbinger of Watery Doom article on Atlas Obscura.